from a boat builder's perspective, they're just beautiful. Particularly if you're looking at the boat, if you look at the transom, which is the stern, it has a distinctive wine glass. They call it the wine glass transom, the shape that it makes. And boat builders really like that because it's a beautiful, kind of complicated curve that they make. And so it's always been a favorite, the shape has been a favorite with wooden boat enthusiasts. But the fact is that it's also an historical design that was created in this harbor for this harbor, and it's historically accurate. It's what people used to use. If you went down to the foot of Whitehall Street, which is where the ferries were in the old days, in talking 1820s, 1830s, this is the kind of boat that you would have hailed to come take you over to Brooklyn or out to a ship. So for us, it was a matter of harking back to that historic tradition, but also of using a design that's really time-tested and safe. Because it was developed for this harbor, it's really made for all the conditions that you would encounter here. And so it's really the perfect all-around boat. I think there was a lot of debate in the early days about what kind of boat should we build. And there were people who were advocating for very traditional designs with real solid wood, and people who wanted boats that only had 3 planks on them because they'd be faster to build. And this has 7 on each side. And in the end, they settled on this basic concept, and then they found an architect who lives upstate, and he drew the plans, and they have stuck with those plans ever since. And so that we have basically a one design class. We built 25 of the same boat. That's called the strong back, that frame, and that's designed to hold the boat in place while you construct it, so it doesn't move and so that it stays rigid and straight. And Don came up with this concept for bridging it with this beam, which is just based on a Toblerone box as a triangle. We start with patterns which we lay onto sheets of plywood, different thicknesses for different parts, and we cut them out with a jigsaw. Then we create the keel and we plane it so that it will take the planks as they come out later, and we cut out the frames and we glue the frames across the keel in regular intervals. The cross pieces that go across the middle of the boat, there's 4 permanent ones and there's some temporaries in there. And then once that skeleton, basically we're building a skeleton. The spine is the keel and the frames are the ribs. And once the skeleton is in place, then we come along with the planks, which we also cut from patterns. That can be a little bit tricky because they don't always fit perfectly. And then we start putting the planks on, and Don developed this technique where you can put all of the planks on in one day, which is what we're trying to do today. In the beginning days, we would put one plank on and let the glue dry, and then glue the next plank to it. So it took 7 days to get 7 planks on. This technique, we put the glue on, put the plank on, and then we screw the plank above into it. So that effectively forms a clamp, and while the glue dries, that screw is in there. As soon as the glue is dry, we'll back all of the screws out and go around and fill those holes with epoxy and then sand them smooth before we paint the boat. One thing to realize about these boats is that it's not about crafting a perfect, beautiful boat. That's not what we're doing here. A traditional boat builder would look at this technique and he would be maybe a little bit aghast because we make a lot of errors and we fill in with epoxy where we haven't made things perfectly. It's about making boats nice looking, safe, and fast boats quickly and getting them out onto the water so that people can get out on the harbor, because that's the real mission. It's not about creating aesthetically beautiful objects. It's about getting people back onto the harbor and reclaiming it as public space. That really is the whole mission. So it's a little misleading at first when you look at the boat and say, oh, that's beautiful, that's that whole wooden boat aesthetic. Really, you got to look at these things as like good-looking Volkswagen buses that are designed to get groups of people, community groups, out onto the water together and really using the harbor as open space. They can hold a lot. They're big boats, they're 25 feet long. They were designed as water taxis to carry people around the harbor quickly. If you needed to get out to a ship, you'd take one of these. If you needed to get to Brooklyn, you'd take one of these. But they're designed to have 4 rowers and a coxswain, who's the person who sits in the stern and who steers the boat and looks forward so they can see what's coming. But you could transport people in pretty good numbers across, say, the East River with a boat like this. You know, you see Washington crossing the Delaware in a boat that's not that dissimilar to this. But this design evolved about 50 years later in New York Harbor, in the 1820s. And the same boat was the boat that began the whole racing tradition in New York Harbor. And these boats were raced. There were big, huge public events. Some say it was the beginning of kind of spectator sports in America. The first big race with this style boat drew a crowd of 50,000 people. And that sounds like a lot of people, but when you consider the population of the city was only 150,000 at the time, it was really a huge, huge crowd. We've been rowing these boats, I mean, Floating the Apple's been rowing these boats for almost 15 years, I think, and they've never filled a boat with water. They've taken an occasional spray or maybe an occasional top of a wave has splashed into the boat, but they've never filled one, and that's pretty good because the conditions can be rough. But just another word about these 6-knot currents. They do exist, but if you're a boater, you know, that's what you want, because that current is what takes you to where you want to go. And so you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're trying to row against a 6-knot current, because you're not going to get anywhere. But if you wanted to go from the Battery up to Hellgate, you can do that in an hour or less, in 45 minutes, if you hit the tide right, because it's underneath you and it sweeps you along. And that is fantastic. When you can, when you figure out what's happening in the harbor, you know what the tides are doing, and the conditions are right, you can really get places very, very quickly. I have a new understanding of what it is. It's not a river at all. It's a tidal estuary, and it became the sort of first superhighway in America because it pushes boats or anything that's on it northwards for 6 hours and then back southwards for 6 hours. So it was a conveyor belt, and you could always get stuff upriver and stuff back downriver just with the tide. And if you add sail and oars, then you can move even faster. But even before the steamboat came along, people were making fantastic mileages up and down the Hudson because of the tide and the wind. Sailboats, with the right conditions, a sailboat could go from Manhattan to Albany in a day. It was the engine that kind of drove the development of America and American industry. We now have 17 students plus a few grad students who are helping us on Tuesday afternoon. So we're at about 20, and I think there's going to be a lot of interest in doing this again next year. This is actually an academic course. They get 3 credits for it. It was funny because it filled up right away, and then people started emailing me saying, I really want to be in your class. You've got to figure out a way to get me in. And so we had a wait list.
I deal mainly with theory and what I study, and I don't really get any hands-on experience creating anything. So I saw them building this in the window, and just, you know, I've always liked woodwork. So I asked if I could join the team, and I said sure.
I'm an urban studies major at Lang College, and I took the course because I'm interested in public uses of space and mixed-use space, and so this is a fantastic project. I didn't anticipate how invested I'd become in the boat and how much ownership we're all feeling over it.
The planning, the measuring, the concepts, the materials, the goal, it's all really amazing.
We're excited that we'll be able to donate it to the Hudson River so that people can also go and use it and sail it and have fun.
They've got a big community rowing program. If you want to row, that's totally free, and it's open to anybody who comes down and signs their waiver. You have to put on a life jacket. That's their only requirement. They don't send you out on your own. You go out with somebody who's been certified as a coxswain by them. And if you want to get into the building end of it, they are building boats all over the city, and usually with high school groups, but there's plenty of need for adult volunteers who help supervise that process, and in the process learn how these things are built. It's not that complicated. You know, people who have never done woodworking before are sometimes intimidated, but it's pretty straightforward, and once you've done it once, you really see this is, you know, it's very logical. It's all been broken down into steps, and it's great that you can take 4x8 sheets of plywood, like these just completely rectilinear things, and you transform them into this beautiful curved object in a matter of, I mean, we're figuring 11 or 12 days of actual construction. I think, well, you know, one thing that people don't, they think, oh, well, that's fun. These college kids are building a boat, and that's, you know, it's good for them, and practical skills and problem solving and all that. And that's true. But this is actually an academic course. They get 3 credits for it, and there is an academic component. And every Friday at lunchtime, a speaker comes into class and talks about some aspect or another of the harbor that applies to what we're doing. So we've had a guy come in and talk about the history of the East River, Eric Bard, and talk about Hellgate and how it used to be and how it is now, and also Wallabout Bay, which is now called the Navy Yard. We have had a guy come in and talk about how Manhattan looked in 1609 when Henry Hudson arrived. He's totally reconstructed it from old maps and created a pretty compelling picture of what it was like. So he's been here, and he also talked a bit about restoring the wetlands to the harbor, which is, I think, kind of the next step. Everybody knows that that's what has to start happening, and the next step in park design is going to be reestablishing some of that soft edge that Manhattan doesn't have, and most of New York doesn't have anymore. We're really into seawalls and riprap, and we got to get away from that for a lot of reasons. But you know, environmental ones are pretty high on that list for expense reasons too. And also we have somebody coming from the Port Authority to talk about the business end of the harbor and how that works and how shipping works. We need to be aware of that. We're not saying the harbor is all ours, it's all recreational. We're saying it's public space, it's used for commerce, but it also needs to be, we need to really establish this aspect of the harbor as something that you know, everybody can use, and we need to get out on it. It's one of the, you know, 3 or 4 best harbors in the whole world. Yeah. And it's crazy that there aren't more people out on it. But I think there will be, and there's no question there will be a lot more people out there. And you know, there's a lot of islands out there that people don't go to, but they should go to, that are fantastic destinations in themselves. On the Statue of Liberty, on Liberty Island, there's a fantastic beach that we could easily pull these boats up on. I was riding my bike down the West Side Highway, and I saw one of the boats come out of a container, and it just corresponded to my idea of what a beautiful rowing boat should look like. I couldn't believe there was something like that in New York, in the harbor, and I stopped and talked to this guy, Mike Davis, and within 2 minutes he was telling me stories about Governor's Island in colonial days. He was tying everything together in a great way, and that's when I got involved. And so I first helped build some boats and then started rowing with them, and I've used their boats a lot. I've taken one all the way up the Hudson from Manhattan past Albany to Waterford, New York, which is where the Erie Canal starts. It's 158 miles from the Battery to Waterford, and we stopped there because that's where the Erie Canal and the Champlain Canal branch off. It seemed like a logical place to stop. And it seems like, oh, you're rowing up a river, that's hard, but actually it's tidal all the way to Troy, which is almost all the way. So you use the tide, and when the tide stops, you stop.
All right. Come on.
We camped every night, and that was a really interesting part of the trip, because there are a few campgrounds that you can stop at if you're traveling by water that are authorized, but there are a lot of places where there aren't any official campgrounds, and you just, you know, we call it commando camping. You just kind of land late in the day and make your camp, and then you move on in the morning. it is public land. It's all public land, but it's not officially okayed. And I think one of the things we wanted to do was establish, or help establish, a sort of water trail up and down the Hudson where you could travel like this and camp like this. Bannerman Island, which is just north of Cold Spring, there's a castle on it that's kind of falling down, but a cool old thing that was built around the turn of the last century. And we stopped there. That is now kind of controlled by state parks and a foundation. And there were two people there, and they said, well, we really officially, we can't allow you to land. However, we're leaving in 10 minutes for the day, and whatever happens after that is really none of our business. So we did get a good look. We walked around, we saw the castle, and explored a little bit, and then moved on before dark and camped a couple miles up the river. There's quite a bit of green space. I mean, the whole edge of the Hudson is green, and it's just hard to get to. But if you're in a boat, it's easy to get to.
It's too strong, we can move it down even further.
Similar distance on the other side.
With most groups, we do the fitting and making the plank and spiling the plank and designing it, and just barely get into the gluing, and then have adult volunteers do this part.
Better get a brush in there.
Getting started's easy. Sometimes it's finishing. If you build a boat with a lot of screws and holes, getting the holes filled. Sometimes the enthusiasm runs a little low on the finishing. The first boat we made, about a 6 or 7 year lifespan, but all the rest are still going. Mike Davis and David Lutz started it and came up with the name Floating the Apple and the idea of community boating and not having to own a boat. We went down, down, down. The overlap doesn't feel red. There's the gap. And that one up there is okay? Did that come up any?
These aren't lining up. There were 8 so this one's not lining up.
Where it's down at finger width, that's fine. It's
Okay.
fine. It's fine.
This is fine.
Oh, but what? We've got a gap here.
No, these aren't lining up because they were 20.
Oh, so that's got to put it there.
That one in already? Let's look at
Clamp
that
on
for
it.
a
The orange
second.
one, can you reach it? Okay.
Where is that one? I guess we saw it too soon there, huh?
Yeah, that's okay. That we can deal with. That's just too big. That's just perfect.
Yeah. Well, no, that's just a temporary. That's not a boat line.
And then mark all, because we're going to glue like here and here now.
We'll be done and we'll have it painted. We have to decide what color and what to name it. But we'll pop it out the window here. The plywood came in the door, but the boat won't go out the door. So the glass guys are going to come and take a pane out, and then we'll spin the boat on its side and angle it out. And we think, you never know, but we're pretty confident that it will get out. And then we'll take it down to Pier 40, and then they will start to row it. And I think they will have had a few sessions in similar boats, and so they'll basically know how to row already. But we'll practice a little bit, and when we're confident enough, we'll go across to New Jersey and back. A good crew can do that in 15 minutes. You know, I don't know. I think different people get different things out of it. I know that a couple of grad students have said that after a day of sitting in classrooms talking about ideas, this is the therapy that they need, is to actually do something real with their hands. But, you know, from my standpoint, I want this to feed into something new at the New School, which is this environmental studies multidisciplinary program that we're trying to develop, and an understanding of the outdoors as being not something that you like get in a bus to go to the Catskills, to go outdoors, or up to the White Mountains or the Adirondacks, but it's right here in the city, it's all around us, and you know, just because we live in this big city doesn't mean that we're not completely affected by and involved in the outdoors. We are. It's right here. So that's where I'm going with this.
What we try to do is to keep the shop open to both like a core group of students that are building the boat, and then they do it with volunteers that some have known about the project for since the beginning, and they keep coming back to wherever we're building and want to help build, and are really wonderful to have like that. Those are the, to me, the satisfying people to be working with. Oh yeah, they just want to keep sharing what they know. And we try to keep it open to anybody who really wants to be here. Have boathouses within walking distance of your house. So that was the idea it started, and that's why we have a boathouse here. There's one up 2 miles, and looking to have another one 2 miles around the corner in Brooklyn, and another one up at 96th Street, and they're all within a few miles of each other, but it means that you don't have to travel far to have a place that kind of belongs to you, belongs to everybody. And the idea is to be able to be out on the boat and not have to own or lease the place where you're keeping, but have it in a public place, and not have to own the boat and be responsible for all its maintenance, but to share it. So we have 7 boats here, and they get used. So I think it's a nice thing to be able to do in the city.
Rose!